the Islamic Trade Finance Corporation of the Islamic Development Bank Group. Engineer Hani, you have the floor.
شكرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Excellencies, Mohammed bin Ayad, the Secretary General Ministry in charge of Foreign Trade, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. At the outset, I would like to express on behalf of the Islamic Development Bank Group my profound thanks to His Excellency the Minister of Trade and Industry for really assisting the ITFC group to organize this very important session today. In the same time, I would like to also express my sincere thanks to all the participants and the distinguished resource persons who have made this possible for ITFC and IDB. I wish to express also my gratitude to the Director General WTO, Mr. Roberto Azevedo, who could not be with us today, but kindly he sent a very dedicated video recorded message for this event. I am sure during the course of this session we will benefit from the knowledge and experience of our speakers on very important issue, which is not only challenging but also as a whole really tackles the global community, and we need really to confront and address all these issues this morning, inshallah. Ladies and gentlemen, there could not have been more opportune place than Marrakesh itself really to discuss this international trade and climate change. The reason why I say that is that because Marrakesh, we all know that the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the World Trade Organizations, the WTO, agreed to allowing for the optimal use of the world resources in accordance with the objectives for sustainable development was here. This, I must say, was a historical achievement and must commend the wisdom of the leaders at that time for their really foresight. This reminds us of the commitment and resolves of the global community to tackle international trade and economic endeavors while also preserving the environment in a good manner, which is inconsistent with the varied level of economic development. The recently concluded Paris Agreement on climate change is a testimony of the global leadership continuing resolving to address extremely important subject which can adversely affect economic development if not adequately addressed. We at the IDB group think that it is important and timely to discuss and have an overview of the key linkages between trade and climate change, to have a deeper understanding of their impact on our member countries with a view to address them as well. Ladies and gentlemen, at the International Islamic Trade Finance Corporation's ITFC, we believe that the relationship between climate change and international trade is connected together, and we have to have all the efforts to make this more environmental friendly relationship. Behind every trade transaction, there is a production process and in turn associated greenhouse emissions productions, greenhouse emission and gas production emissions. We believe that trade and environment policies can influence emissions. ITFC is not only a provider of Islamic trade finance, but also a development financial institution that serves its member countries, and it is dedicated to provide development assistance to the socio-economic welfare of people. We believe at ITFC that trade and climate change issues are also very, very much linked, especially in our member countries, where a large number of their economic really heavily depend on sectors like agriculture, which is highly vulnerable for climate change. Reports by the WTO and UN UNEP provide ample examples of affected sectors like agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and tourism, and to name few, which are very vital for the economic development countries. Needless to point out as to how events induced by climate change, such as global warming, are having substantial negative impact on agriculture, livestock, fisheries, and water resources. The concerns of farmers in Asia and Africa is increasingly as a climate change became a global issue, and it is also directly affecting them. In order to address this phenomena, farmers not only need to be supported in adapting the climate change challenges, but also in reducing their environmental footprint. This is especially relevant given that agriculture and other land use accounts for about 25% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to quote an example to bring forward the points as how climate change is really affecting agriculture. Factors affecting coffee, for example, the coffee crops. Productions include lengthy droughts and high temperature. This can disrupt also by heavy rainfalls and more resilient pests, plants, and diseases. These factors are always associated with climate change. ITFC recognized these challenges, and we recognize it is really facing our member countries. So due to this climate change and concrete examples also of how we really try to support our member countries. I wish really also to give an example of support ITFC has really provided for member countries, especially for farmers in Indonesia. In order to support these farmers in Indonesia, ITFC, in collaborations with the Indonesian Coffee Exporters Association, developed an Indonesian coffee export development program in 2016 to cater for better trading conditions for the farmers while supporting them in adapting and mitigating climate change. The program plans to work with 200,000 farmers over 3 years. ITFC designed also a 1 million Murabaha trade finance operations in Indonesia for the coffee sector to meet their pre-export financing requirements in 2011. It was very successful. The impact of this operation in this structure has a twofold. First of all, ITFC directly financed the pre-export working capital requirements of the exporters. Secondly, and more importantly, by making payments to the suppliers who were actually the fair trade and organic certified cooperatives, about 6,000 of them in five regions. Ladies and gentlemen, the most interesting aspect of ITFC program is its fair trade premiums and related climate standards that will impact the 200,000 farmers in Indonesia. I would like really also to say that the financing at the end will contribute to the end buyer emissions reductions. At the end of the supply chain, those purchasing fair trade carbon credits must implement a reliable plan to reduce their emissions and increasingly compensate for their emissions with fair trade carbon credit. ITFC commitment to advancing the agenda of sustainable trade finance gives ITFC a clear competitive advantage in engaging stakeholders to support international trade that addresses the challenges of climate change. ITFC, along with its member countries and partners, is committed to promoting sustainable development trade while incorporating climate change policies throughout the process. And we invite you today to join us in fulfilling this very important mandate. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, we assure the global community of our continued support to this agenda. We stand ready to receive your valuable suggestions today during the course of this event for providing any support, be it in terms of trade financing or capacity building in enhancing sustainable trade. I wish you all a very successful deliberations. Thank you very much for your listening. Thank you.
Thanks to His Excellency Engineer Hani Sombul, the Chief Executive Officer of the International Trade Finance Corporation and the Islamic Development Bank Group, for these quite critical remarks on the efforts that the ITFC has taken so far to contribute to the global effort to reduce climate change through trade-related interventions. Some of the examples given in some of our member countries show clearly how the contribution to improving trade within member countries reduces directly the carbon footprint and the carbon emissions that results from trade, transportation, and trade-related activities. This is what we call a regional view that touches on the OIC region as a whole, which covers about 57 member countries, covering the whole OIC member countries. We shall be hearing more of a national view, but the contribution of one of our key member countries that is hosting the Conference of Parties COP22 now, the Kingdom of Morocco, on what Morocco is contributing in relation to international and foreign trade to reduce climate change. The remarks on this regard are given to us by His Excellency Mr. Mohammed bin Ayad, the Secretary General of the Foreign Trade Ministry of the Kingdom of Morocco. Please, you have the floor.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أود في البداية أن أشكر شكرا جزيلا مجموعة البنك الإسلامي للتنمية على إتاحتها لنا هذه الفرصة للتعاون من أجل تدارس إمكانيات الاشتغال جميعا حول العلاقة بين التجارة الدولية والمحافظة على المناخ. وأود أن أشكر بشكل خاص السيد هاني سنبل على إصراره وتعاونه، واسمحوا لي أن أرحب كذلك بكل الحاضرين على حضورهم أولا وعلى مساهمتهم ثانيا. اسمحوا لي أن أمر إلى الفرنسية إن كان بالإمكان. Notre séminaire couvre aujourd'hui un sujet complexe car il traite de la relation entre l'environnement et le commerce international. Il a l'ambition de cerner une réponse à une question fondamentale qui ne date pas d'ailleurs d'aujourd'hui, à savoir comment le commerce international peut-il influencer la protection de l'environnement et contribuer à cet effort mondial de plus en plus engagé en faveur d'une économie durable et respectueuse de la planète bleue. Convient-il à cet égard de mentionner que la relation entre le commerce et le développement durable n'est ni facile ni aisée à élucider, car dès qu'on commence à vouloir être pratique et imaginer des mesures de politique commerciale à même de contribuer à l'effort de protection de l'environnement, on se trouve démuni et dépendant d'autres sphères de la politique économique, comme la politique industrielle, agricole, etc. Sinon, on reste tributaire des comportements humains et des habitudes de consommation qui conditionnent l'offre et la demande et par conséquent les échanges entre les nations. En effet, on ne peut échanger que ce qu'on produit. Et si les contraintes de protection de l'environnement ne sont pas prises en considération dans les processus de production, je vois mal comment la politique commerciale pourrait prendre des mesures à même d'influencer les processus de production, car ces derniers eux-mêmes ne font qu'essayer de répondre aux desiderata des consommateurs. En plus, ce sont ces desiderata combinés aux dotations aux ressources des pays qui conditionne l'offre et la demande internationale et par conséquent le volume du commerce international. Et ce sont ces désirata qui constituent le fondement même du commerce international à travers le façonnement de l'avantage comparatif des nations. Rappelons-le, cette notion constitue actuellement le fondement même de l'échange entre les nations. Elle guide la politique commerciale et elle est à la base de tout système de réglementation internationale, du fait qu'elle rappelle la notion comparative de rapport qualité-prix des produits et services que l'on échange. Si l'on introduit demain le paramètre de protection de l'environnement, on sera amené certainement à changer cette équation, qui est demeurée des siècles comme repère quasi dogmatique qui oriente le sens du commerce international. Ceci confirme d'ailleurs qu'on est déjà dans une nouvelle ère où l'on aurait besoin d'inventer d'autres façons de commercer si l'on veut protéger notre planète. Une illustration mérite d'être évoquée pour que l'on puisse imaginer le chemin qui nous reste à parcourir. En effet, que l'on promeut un commerce international propre, il nous faut en premier lieu des systèmes de production propres et des exigences de demande des consommateurs pour la production propre. Cette première transition est fondamentale car on ne peut échanger que ce qu'on produit et ce qu'on désire consommer. En plus, pour opérer les échanges commerciaux, il va falloir s'atteler à produire des moyens de transport propres. Cette contrainte de taille risque à terme de se traduire par une contraction du commerce international, car l'on va privilégier de réduire les intermédiaires et favoriser la consommation des produits locaux. Ce n'est peut-être pas une mauvaise chose pour l'humanité, sauf si l'on rénove nos moyens de transport et l'on met en place les politiques commerciales idoines qui minimisent ce risque. À cet effet, nos pays sont invités à adopter des politiques commerciales qui contribueraient à la protection de l'environnement, sans toutefois créer de nouvelles barrières déguisées au commerce, à travers la mise en place des normes et standards environnementaux ayant comme principal objectif le retour à la protection désastreuse des économies. La libéralisation du commerce ne doit également pas se traduire par une modification de l'échelle de production et de la consommation dans des conditions qui peuvent conduire à une démultiplication des effets dommageables pour l'environnement. Il nous faut lever le dogme en faveur de l'avantage comparatif aux dépens de la protection de l'environnement. En effet, le concept de l'avantage comparatif doit être lu et appréhendé autrement en intégrant dans les coûts les externalités environnementales aussi bien positives que négatives. C'est là un grand chantier de la politique commerciale où il s'agira d'incorporer le coût et les bénéfices environnementaux dans la prise en compte de l'avantage comparatif. Une telle approche changerait fondamentalement la segmentation de la chaîne mondiale des valeurs et permettrait de mettre plus de cohérence entre les politiques commerciales et les politiques environnementales dans un cadre global régi par les instances multilatérales. Certes, c'est un chantier, comme je l'ai dit au début de mon intervention, complexe et ni facile ni aisé à élucider. Mais l'on peut déjà l'entamer par 3 leviers simples et qui sont à notre portée aujourd'hui. Il s'agit de donner la priorité dans nos politiques de promotion et de protection aux entreprises qui s'engagent dans l'économie verte, simplifier les procédures et encourager le commerce électronique. Nous avons déjà testé ces pistes dans notre pays et nous croyons qu'elles sont prometteuses. En effet, le Maroc a pris le soin d'intégrer dans sa législation du commerce extérieur, fondée sur le principe de la libéralisation des importations et des exportations, la possibilité de prendre des mesures commerciales restrictives lorsqu'il s'agit de la préservation de l'environnement. À cet égard, diverses mesures de limitation des importations et des exportations des produits ont été mises en place pour des raisons de protection de l'environnement. Cela permet notamment d'encourager les activités de recyclage et de réduire la surexploitation de certaines ressources naturelles au profit du maintien de l'équilibre des écosystèmes. Par ailleurs, à l'occasion de la tenue les 23 et 24 novembre 2016, ici même, à Marrakech, de la 11e conférence internationale et des prix internationaux des organismes de promotion des exportations, le Maroc plaidera, entre autres, pour le lancement d'une charte de promotion des produits et services qui respectent l'environnement. Il s'agira de l'introduction d'une discrimination positive en faveur de ces produits dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre des politiques de promotion des exportations, sous forme de réduction de leurs coûts de promotion à l'étranger. En effet, si tous les pays s'engagent dans cette voie, on contribuera certainement au renforcement de la part des produits et services respectueux des normes environnementales dans le volume global du commerce. Par ailleurs, la facilitation des échanges, notamment à travers la dématérialisation des procédures et des documents du commerce extérieur, constitue également un domaine de politique commerciale qui peut se traduire au-delà des gains qu'apporte la dématérialisation des documents du commerce extérieur en termes de réduction des coûts et des délais, de transparence et de traçabilité. Elle peut apporter beaucoup de bénéfices écologiques substantiels. Je me permets de rappeler à cet égard que l'expérience marocaine, qui sera présentée d'ailleurs aujourd'hui en détail par Sibn Hiyoun, démontre que l'échange des données informatisées entre les différents acteurs de la communauté du commerce extérieur via un guichet unique national du commerce extérieur génère des effets positifs sur la protection de l'environnement à travers l'élimination de l'utilisation du papier et des déplacements des opérateurs ou leurs transitaires entre les différentes administrations et organes impliqués dans l'importation et l'exportation. Cette dématérialisation engendre un gain important en termes de préservation de forêts, de réduction des déchets, d'économie dans la consommation de carburant et par conséquent la réduction de l'émission du gaz CO2. En plus, cette facilitation, combinée au développement du commerce électronique, nous permettra d'ouvrir les productions à petite échelle, respectueuses de l'environnement, aux avantages du commerce international. Et par ricochet, on évitera de faire de la protection de l'environnement une excuse pour cloisonner les économies. Promouvoir le commerce électronique serait ainsi un levier de contribution de la protection de l'environnement, surtout s'il est accompagné par une politique de promotion incitative à la protection de l'environnement. Des politiques commerciales spécifiques permettraient certainement de contribuer à l'effort de réduction des comportements pollueurs de notre environnement. Ce sont là trois pistes complémentaires qui méritent, à notre avis, de bénéficier d'une attention particulière des organismes d'appui tels que la Banque islamique pour le développement. Ils inscriraient définitivement nos pays dans le futur et dans l'effort collectif d'action que prône la COP22 qui cadre notre réunion d'aujourd'hui. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
شكرا جزيلا لسعادة الأستاذ محمد بالعيد. Many thanks to His Excellency Mr. Mohammed Bel'Eid, the Secretary General of the Foreign Trade Ministry of Morocco. We all know and heard a very well-established effort efforts of Morocco towards reducing climate change in major sectors that are known to us, such as sustainable and renewable energy. We also know the efforts the kingdom is making towards sustainable agriculture, as well as sustainable transport. But what we heard today, interestingly, another side of the efforts, or the continuous efforts of one of our key member countries on how trade, and foreign trade in particular, addresses the issue of climate change sensitively and adheres to codes to bring in lesser the effort on climate change. Key ones in particular is the promotion of liberalization of trade that, of course, reduces the time needed for transport and subsequently reduces the carbon that results from trade transport. As well as enhancement of corridor. We know very well how much Morocco avails itself as a bridge to connect trade between the market in Europe as well as the sub-Saharan Africa, and providing all the tools necessary to provide smooth movement of trade along the Moroccan lands between Europe and Africa. And this enhances directly on the carbon emissions and the carbon footprint resulting from international trade. Now we heard the local view, more of contribution of one member country to the whole region and the whole global efforts on climate change. We'd like to hear an international and a global view, and that is to be addressed to us today with apology on a recorded message by His Excellency Roberto Azevedo, the Director General of the World Trade Organization, who has recorded a specific message to address this event.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I'm very pleased to have the chance to send this message. The Paris Agreement was a historic moment. Now we must turn that promise into reality. And I think the international trade community has an important contribution to make. We need to create a virtuous circle of trade and environmental policies which promote sustainable production and consumption while also being pro-growth and development. And this is not without its challenges, but a look at the WTO's track record suggests that it can be done. For example, in 2013, WTO members agreed the Trade Facilitation Agreement aimed at tackling red tape and cumbersome customs procedures. By implementing this agreement, countries can make trade more efficient, reducing waste and pollution related to long and unnecessary delays at the border. In addition, last year, WTO members agreed to abolish agricultural export subsidies, and this is important for a number of reasons. First, it delivered a crucial target of the Sustainable Development Goal on zero hunger. Second, it can help to reduce inefficient farming practices and overproduction, thereby helping to encourage more sustainable agriculture. It may also help governments to redirect their efforts towards minimizing the huge pressures that climate change puts on global agricultural and food systems. Now, these are positive steps, and there is a clear sense now that we can do more to help countries make their contributions under the Paris Agreement. One example is our work on environmental goods agreement. A group of WTO members is working to eliminate tariffs on a broad range of environmental goods. And in fact, they are looking to conclude the deal as early as next month. The focus here is on technologies to help mitigate and adapt to climate change, mainly through improvements in energy efficiency and greater access to renewable energy. Lowering barriers to trade in these goods and services would help producers and consumers worldwide to access a wide range of green technologies at lower costs. It would support efforts, particularly in developing countries, to leapfrog towards adopting climate-friendly technologies. It would help to stimulate innovation. And it would create valuable opportunities for businesses around the world to join the global networks involved in the production of environmental goods. But of course, simply throwing open markets won't do the job. We also need to ensure that everyone has the tools and skills needed to participate. Now, this is where I think our partners in the trade finance community, including the ITFC, can make an extremely valuable contribution. We all know that access to trade finance continues to be an issue for many traders across the globe, in developing and developed countries alike, with smaller businesses facing the greatest hurdles of them all. Globally, over half of trade finance requested by SMEs, they are rejected. And for multinationals, it's just 7%. It's a very striking contrast. Now, trade finance is essential if we want to support the transfer of green technologies. And it is essential if we want to put the innovative, fast-paced startup mentality of many SMEs around the world to work for trade, climate, and sustainable development. I heard recently about a small company in Cambodia that is producing solar tuk-tuks. They are adapting imported technologies and incorporated them into locally produced components. Now, there are an estimated 10,000 gasoline tuk-tuks in the capital, Phnom Penh. I imagine how different it would be if we could replace that gasoline with solar power. It could create green jobs, lower emissions, improve health for local residents, and in time support the emergence of an export industry. By working together, we can play our part in creating the conditions that will allow such success stories to flourish around the world and help deliver big wins for the economy, for society, and for the environment. Of course, governments will be key in delivering the Paris Agreement, but we also need to empower people to act. And that means supporting sustainable startups and others to change our economies, providing them with the finance, the skills, and the favorable system of rules that they need to succeed. I look forward to working with the ITFC to help deliver on this and much more. Thank you all for listening, and I wish you a very successful event.
Well, thanks to His Excellency Mr. Roberto Azevedo, who is the Director General of World Trade Organization. We have seen the efforts taken by a global organization to improve trade and support sustainability of trade towards a better intervention and introduction towards the environment, and help to reduce climate change, mainly through the Paris Agreement, trade facilitation. We also shouldn't forget that the major agreement of the sustainable and optimal use of resources was established here in the same city in Marrakesh, the Marrakesh Agreement, which makes the soul and the heart of the WTO agreements. With that, please join me to thank all the excellencies who have opened this session. And we will be moving to our first session of the two sessions today on trade and sustainable development and climate change. I would like to call upon Dr. Abdul Latif Bello, who will be representing Dr. Savaj Albai, the Chief Economist of the Islamic Development Bank Group, who apologizes for not being able to be here with us today. I would like to also call upon Dr. Robert Hamway. He is the Senior Economic Affairs Officer, Trade, Environment, Sustainable Development and Climate Change branch of UNCTAD. And we also have Ms. Lilia Naas. She is the Chief Officer for Arab States of the International Trade Center in Geneva. And with us here today is Mr. Jalal bin Hayoun. He's the Director General of Portnet in Morocco. Welcome to our panelists this morning, and would like to share with the audiences the key messages that we hope to get out of these discussions, and what we are trying to achieve today. Mostly is to get a clear understanding of the relation between trade, mostly international trade, and the impact on climate change, and what we can do from the various institutions in terms of reducing that impact directly. I would like to start with a few words on our history in IDB with the trade. The IDB, as you all know, is a multilateral development bank, same as the other multilateral development banks, but it was one of the leaders that worked on trade long ago since its inception. I recall words from our president who has just left the IDB recently, Dr. Ahmed Ali, who has raised concerns about questions from other MDBs, kept asking IDB, why do you work on trade? We are all working on development, simply financing infrastructure. What interest do you have in trade? But today, there is no one single multilateral development bank that's not engaged in trade. And that's a clear indication of how trade is important to development, to start with. But then we come to see how trade does contribute to climate change as well, since it's the theme of what we are here for today. IDB has established along the regions and the times the International Trade Finance Corporation arm to take up seriously more the effect of trade. Today, our annual approvals at the IDB group, almost 50% goes to just trade finance. And the efforts are greater. And that shows how within the group we pay a lot of interest and importance to the issue of supporting trade towards a better development. We're also leading the AFTIAS initiative, which is the Aid for Trade for the Arab states, and we hope that we can enlarge the concept to other member states soon also. So on that note, I think very clearly that the trade does contribute to climate change directly, not only through transport. One of the new concepts that recently established by UNEP and other key environmental institutions was about the importance of promoting agri-industry so that countries and communities would rely more on local productions, and that would reduce the impact on international trade and thus reduce the transport involved in the international trade. So I would like to stop here as a way of introduction and allowing the key panelists to address the audiences today on how each of the institutions would address the climate change through their process of business and conduct of business on a daily basis. I would start with Dr. Abdul Latif Bello from the Islamic Development Bank, the Chief Economist Complex, to share with us today how IDB addresses issues of trade in relation to climate change impact. So Dr. Abdul Latif, you have the floor.
I have a slide here. Good morning to you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I will take you through some of basic information about the linkage between climate change and international trade. And later on, I will come up with some ideas on how international trade can help in reducing climate change. We all know that we are in a new reality. Climate change is an existential threat as well as a global risk. It presents both challenges and opportunities that we can take advantage of. If you look at trade and climate change, there's a very strong linkages. Climate change can disturb supply and distribution chains, thereby raising costs of international trade. We also know that it can also lead the country to produce a few goods in which it has a comparative advantage. Trade sector also contributes to climate change through generation of greenhouse emission over the course of production and consumption. It increased trade leads directly to more global greenhouse gas emission from increased transport of goods. And lastly, we know from all latest resources that we need to, in order for us to combat climate change, we need at least $90 trillion in infrastructure worldwide between now and 2030. Investments, these 90 trillion needs to go to low carbon energy and energy efficient projects. And that's where trade matters, because trade is used as a source of wealth. we need to generate money to be able to meet this investment gap. Now, many of you may not be aware of this graph. This is an important graph because we are telling you here that from 1980 up to the latest data available from IMF, before the financial crisis, global trade has averaged 6.1%. When the crisis struck in 2009, global trade declined by 12%. And from there, up to the current moment, we are seeing an average of 3%, which means global trade declined by half of what it used to be in previous decade. Now, with this condition, on one hand, and look at this graph as well, we see that many countries are vulnerable to climate index. If you try to combine the two, on one hand, we see a very sharp decline in global trade. And many of our member countries, you see all these pictures in red, they are mostly IDB member countries, or, so to speak, developing countries. They're all vulnerable to climate change. So that could really have serious impact on the ability of these countries to engage in international trade. Now, this is another interesting schematic graph, which shows clearly the strong linkage between international trade and climate change. On top of this map, sorry, I need to move closer. You see on the right-hand side there, trade and investment law and policy. This is WTO. On the extreme left here, you have climate change policy, this is UNFCCC. Because both of them involve in laws and policies, there's a strong linkage in terms of legal. There should be a legal linkage between the two. And when this thing happens, we talk about climate change. On the extreme right there, WTO policies and laws affect trade and investment. Climate change and policy also affect climate change. The linkage between climate change and trade investment is below there, the physical impact. If climate change could have serious physical impact on trade and investment through, for instance, destruction in trade-related infrastructure. So you can see a very strong linkage between this and that. So this is a very strong schematic diagram that clearly shows the relationship between climate change, trade, and investment. On the, between climate change and trade and investment directly, there is implication for competitiveness impact. The policies enacted for climate change globally by UNFCCC could have implication in terms of competitiveness of trade and investment in many member countries. So this is just an overview of how to show clearly the strong linkage between international trade and climate change. This will help us to stimulate discussion as we move forward. We are here to discuss an important topic. How can international trade help in reducing climate change? I will come up with some suggestions. As I showed you a few minutes ago, we have UNFCCC and we have WTO. There's a need for us to align and link legal policies between these two institutions vis-a-vis national measures against climate change. We know that many countries are now developing their climate action plans. They cannot do this alone. They need to link their policies or measures with global policies and laws. Now, let me quote Article 2.3 of the Kyoto Protocol. As you're aware, the protocol was very, very important a few years ago. It clearly says that we should strive to implement policies and measures in such a way as to minimize adverse effects, including adverse effects on climate change, effect on international trade. I quoted this to really demonstrate the strong linkage between these two institutions. Climate change, on the other hand, managed by UNFCCC, international trade laws and policies by WTO. So the Kyoto Protocol, Article 2.3, spells this out clearly. The second option, as I listen clearly to the WTO Secretary General, I'm so happy that WTO is coming out with environmental goals in terms of policies and guidelines. For international trade to really reduce climate change action, we need to remove and eliminate tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade in environmental goods. Essentially, these are the green goods and services, e.g. solar batteries. If you see recently, lithium batteries are falling dramatically by 65% or 35%, depending on the studies you look at. We need all these things to operate renewable energy plants. So really, for international to make a dent on reducing climate change, there's a need for us to focus on removing barriers. We also need to ensure that national legislations on greenhouse gases does not unduly impact the international trade and competitiveness of local companies. Countries will not just embark on issuing national legislation on greenhouse without looking at the implication on how competitiveness their local firms will be going forward. We need also to provide, countries need to provide climate-friendly environment, such as emission allowance and tax rebate on exported green goods to really stimulate involvement of exported goods in green goods. Countries, as we see, have been going through tough time. Many countries are now embarking on economic diversification. That diversification should include gradual transition to green economy. If we really want to address climate change globally, countries in part of the transformation should include a gradual transition into green economy. Countries should also avoid trade protectionism by all means if it really want to support climate change. There's also need to respect intellectual property right to support innovation and transfer of technology. And finally, a message to ITFC. ITFC need to scale up trade financing, green goods and services. Thank you.
Thanks to Dr. Bello in showing and sharing with us some of his thoughts and ideas of how we can better improve or reduce our carbon footprint through improving trade, mainly trade facilitations. But I will come back to you, Dr. Bello, with some of the questions. I saw your proposal about twinning between WTO and UNFCCC. You're calling for a global crisis between the UN system and the non-UN system. That is not politically easy, as said. So, but we will see how we can hopefully get to that. Let us first listen to Dr. Robert Hamway from the Environmental Sustainable Development and Climate Change branch of UNCTAD on how UNCTAD does contribute to reducing climate change. Please, Dr. Robert.
Thank you, Abdul Hakim. And it's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I'd like to thank the ITFC and the Islamic Development Bank and also the government of Morocco for sponsoring this side event. I'd like to start off following up on some of the ideas that Abdul Latif put out on the floor, and also coming back to what Abdul Hakim has just said about a need for coherency between trade rules and climate policies. So looking at coherency between the WTO and the UNFCCC regime for climate policy. So let me start with the first slide. I'd like to start with the, I have this, sorry. I'll just be very quick, and I'll try to do this as fast as I can. I want to talk about climate change, what we can do about it, climate change and trade, and then later on, when all four of us finish speaking, I'm sure we'll have time for discussion. So I'd like to start off with a few dramatic pictures, because I don't want to just talk about trade without saying something about climate change. I know we have some people in the room that are trade people, we have some people that are climate people, so I'd like to bring us all up to being on the same page. This is some pictures I managed to get from Alaska, and you can see what's happened just within this century, within the last 60, 70 years. These are taken from the same spot at the same season of the year. So this is the Northwestern Glacier in Alaska. Here's another glacier in Alaska, 1917 picture, and this is 2005. So the naysayers of climate change, and I understand that there'll be a new one in the United States very soon who'll be redesigning the Environmental Protection Agency, I think they need to look at pictures like this. They also need to look at the polar ice cap, which has receded significantly in just the past 40 years. Now, we all know the greenhouse gases, what they are. The main one is CO2, carbon dioxide, but we also have methane, we also have nitrous oxide, and we have the CFCs and the HCFCs, which are the hydrofluorocarbons. And fortunately, if you've listened to the news about 3 weeks ago, some important progress was made on reducing the emissions of these halocarbon gases. So that's a good thing. I would like also to note the buildup of accumulation of the, here we have the emissions, but the increase of the emissions in the greenhouse gases continues to march on almost unimpeded. But most of the increase, if you look at this graph, most of the increase is in the CO2. And so naturally, the CO2 is the main target of our mitigation efforts. Now, if we look also at the IPCC report, we know where the emissions are coming from, no problem. And we go further and we can start to look at the effects. So now there's enough evidence to show that the observations, which are the black lines here, the black lines in the graph show the observations. So whether we look at the land surface temperatures or we look at the ocean heat content, we see that the observations cannot be explained by natural forcings alone. And it is necessary to look at human-induced or anthropogenic changes as being the cause of the increase in temperatures, both in the atmosphere and in the ocean, that we have already observed. And this is happening all over the world. So the IPCC assessment reports tell us that. Okay. What about stabilization? We need to know how much reduction is needed in order to meet the Copenhagen target of not having the temperature increase more than 2 degrees from the pre-industrial levels. And from knowing in all of these possible scenarios of carbon dioxide increasing in concentration in the atmosphere, we know that we have to get to a stabilization level of about 450 parts per million. So that's one of the lower, on the top graph, that's one of the lower trajectories. And then from that, we know what we have to do with emissions to keep concentrations at that level. And so we have to go for one of the more extreme reduction scenarios that have been presented to us by the scientists. Now, we need to do this at the same time that population is growing, and population should be over 9 billion people by 2050. That's only about 30 years from now. And we're going to have to increase GDP because we have sustainable development goals at the same time, which says reduce poverty worldwide. Reduce poverty worldwide for 9 billion people, you have to increase GDP by 3 times from current levels. So in order to do that, you've got to do that at the same time you're reducing the CO2 emissions and the other greenhouse gas emissions by significant amounts. So there is a serious challenge. What can we do about it? Okay, we're promoting since the Rio Plus 20 the Rio Plus 20 meeting in Brazil just recently, the summit in 2012, and with the new 2030 development agenda of the UN, we're talking about green growth now. So green growth is the new paradigm. And through green growth, we should try to find a development path that allows us to cut the carbon emissions, but at the same time, we should have an increase in the production of environmentally friendly and green products. We talked about the efforts that are underway in Geneva to reduce tariffs on these goods. That's the good news. I think the bad news is that what Mr. Azevedo told us is not the complete story. He did say that it's a group of countries that are involved in doing this. They're mostly developed countries, and they're doing it only for environmental technologies, which are the solar batteries, the solar panels, the wind turbines, the valves, the pumps, all of these type of industrialized products which are of export interest to developed countries. Now, on the other hand, you have a number of developing countries who are not in the negotiations, who also believe that environmental goods should be viewed in its wider sense. So you have a number of green goods like organic agricultural products. You have also as well sustainably harvested timber products, sustainably harvested fisheries products, a number of natural medicines and natural household products that also need to be promoted and should be considered in a list like this because their production and consumption also is associated with reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the bad news. So there's the good news that some countries are trying to promote a reduction in tariff and non-tariff barriers for green goods, but their list of green goods is rather limited. So what are we essentially trying to do in a nutshell? Reduce greenhouse gas emissions, produce green goods and services, and create new green jobs. So the first thing to do is, I'm going to go to a little bit of economics here. We have to basically fix a market failure because we have a lot of brown industries that, if you look at the inputs of production, you have capital, labor, and you have environment and natural resources. So if we looked at all of those, we would see that the cost of production doesn't include environment. So the basic business model of most firms and industries today continues to be that costs equal capital plus labor. The environmental degradation, the environmental costs are left out of the equation. And this is essentially what we're going to try to do with the green growth type of policies, is to internalize this environmental externality. Now, there are a number of ways to do that, but essentially they fall into about three categories. The first is you have command and control instruments, which are decrees. These are regulations, standards, and bans. And what the government does is it imposes those regulations, standards, and bans on industry, and ideally the industry turns green. You also have economic instruments, two types: penalties, which are charges, fees, and taxes, which the polluting company has to pay to the central government, and the government can then use this money to remediate the environment. And then you have the other type of economic instrument, which is a reward, a motivation, it's support, where the government provides funds and subsidies and other favorable economic benefits to firms that become green. Now, you would say the problem is solved. If we use these instruments, we can solve the problem. So, first of all, we could have the decrees, we could solve the problem, we could also have the penalties, solve the problem, we could also have the rewards, again, solve the problem. In each case now, if you look at total cost of production, we're including the environmental costs, finally, for the first time. Now, there is a number of different policy instruments that national governments can use, and many national governments will be using these policy instruments when they devise and set out what their national reduction commitments are, their NDCs, nationally determined commitments under the UNFCCC. So some of these will be involved. Now, they range from being hard to soft instruments, and being from instruments that reward or penalize or even support companies. There are many available. And now we look at the link between trade, and we see that if countries didn't trade, there wouldn't be any problem at all. Because the big problem with trade, the interaction of trade and climate change, are the competitiveness issues. So, if countries didn't trade, no problem, but they do. We could also say if all countries had the same regulations, the same policies, again, no problem, but they don't. So this is where the crux of the controversies come in when you look at trade and environment issues. In the real world, there are some green policies that will not be compatible with WTO trade rules. Does that mean that we just don't do those policies, or does that mean we have to revisit the WTO trade rules? I think what we were saying, Abdul Hakim and Abdul Latif, is maybe it's time to revisit the WTO trade rules and to make sure that national policies to mitigate climate change become WTO compatible. Export subsidies, local content requirements have already been raised by a number of member states as causing trade distortion. And so this has gone to WTO dispute settlement panels already. That's happened with China for solar panels. That's also happened in Canada for local content requirements for renewable energy. And we expect this to increase. Now, out of all of those different policy options that might be available in the policy universe, some of them are not WTO compatible, and maybe we need to look at how to repair that situation. But many of the others will be WTO compatible, so they should be okay. Here, in this graph, you can see that the more tradable a good or a service becomes or is on the right-hand side of the graph, the less policy space there will be for green policies, national green policies, or climate change policies to influence those without the country getting into some trade dispute later on along the way. On the left, where things are not tradable, a national government can do almost anything, and no other country is going to complain. So here I've just tried to summarize this. The changes in relative competitiveness are the real problem. So you can have three countries, country A, country B, and country C. And we start off with total cost. I'm putting it as a bar in a graph. On the left-hand side, in country A, there's no green policy, and there's no change in costs. In country B, there's a penalty policy, so the firm has an increased cost. In country C, the government decides to use a reward policy, and so there's a decrease in cost of production for the firm. You can already see that the trade patterns will change. The country with the reward policy might see its firms exporting more than before these policies were introduced. And that is a trade distortion. So we need to resolve these trade distortions. Next, if we have, in this case, let's say that they all use policies that are not trade distorting. Then obviously a country that has producers that can reduce costs because they're green producers, they have a comparative advantage, their exports will increase. That's the good case of using trade to reduce climate change. If we can encourage the growth of these green producers without having any trade distorting policies that somebody would try to litigate against, another country would try to litigate against in WTO, then you have a winning proposition. So at UNCTAD, what are we trying to do? We're trying to do that. We're trying to, without having any trade distorting policies in place to protect or to promote an industry, we are going to countries, we are helping those countries identify their green goods, and then we are helping those countries to increase their capacity to produce and increase the total volume of exports for those goods. And we're doing this through a program we called National Green Export Reviews. There'll be a side event on this afternoon if you're more interested in this particular. This afternoon. And at that time, the Islamic Development Bank, Abdul Hakim, will be there. I think he'll be happy to tell you that the bank and UNCTAD will be partnering to mutually support through financing gracefully made available by the Islamic Development Bank to support additional countries to undertake these projects with UNCTAD. So thank you very much.
Again, Dr. Robert, thanks very much. We still go back to the issue of trying to merge the thoughts between the two big players on trade in the global level, the World Trade Organization and the United Nations Commission for Trade and Development, UNCTAD. The only thing they have agreed to once was to get married and deliver a baby called ITC. And the International Trade Center is a center that was created by both institutions, and that is the only thing so far that they get together. But it's one of our key partners at the IDB. And with us today here is Ms. Lilian Naas, who covers the Arab states section of the center, and would like to hear from the ITC, hopefully some numbers on how trade contributes to climate change. Lilia.
Bonjour, tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. It's my honor to be with you today. Thank you very much for ITFC and the IDB for the invitation. There isn't a lot to add after Abdul Latif and Robert, and it is true that we are the baby of the WTO and UNCTAD, so we have to marry the positions between the two. I don't have a presentation. I just prepared a few words to say and more, which is really the ITC approach to look at practical examples of where we have seen opportunities for developing countries to use the opportunity of climate change to be able to perform better in terms of exports. From our perspective, we think that trade impacts the level of emissions through three major channels. The first one is the scale or intensity of economic activity. The composition. The second one is the composition or the share of different goods that are in production, whether they are environmentally friendly or not, green products or not, and the techniques or the production methods, meaning intensive use of natural resources or not. An approach where these three factors are managed in a balanced way and with the appropriate policy framework would result in reduced level of emissions. But this approach would pose many challenges, but presents also many opportunities for developing countries. The speakers before me already talked a lot about the link between trade policies and environment policies. There is still a lot of work to be done to explore the link between the two more in depth and what impact or effect it may have on developing countries. From the ITC point of view, imposing inappropriate climate policies on exporters worsens the situation of many of them being SMEs that represent 50% of global GDP, 60-70% of employment in both the informal and formal sector. These SMEs are actually in the front line in both adapting to climate change and undertaking mitigation actions. But because they are small in size, they face disproportionately high cost to adapt and mitigate. Therefore, facing a competitiveness difficulty and not being able to trade and to enter the market because of these contradicting policies or heavy policies on them, and of course I'm talking about SMEs in developing countries, it results in lowering their income, but also it represents with impact on livelihood, on reduced resilience, and negative impact on poor and vulnerable part of the population. One idea which was, I think, discussed even in COP21 was to price the external cost of green gas emission into the economy. This could be most effective and efficient, but some of the countries see the carbon prices as a factor that would inhibit their competitiveness. For example, countries that heavily depend on tourism fear that aviation taxes would drive away tourists. So we thought, how can we look at this from another angle and see what are actually the opportunities? And we see in many developing countries that greater sustainability in production and consumption is creating incentives for SMEs to innovate and be what we call environment entrepreneurs to develop environmental goods and services by introducing new techniques for more efficient use of natural resources. For example, and this is not necessarily ITC work, but we have seen in the last few years, and the last many years, we have seen double-digit growth for several decades in organic segments of the market, sustainably certified timber and fisheries, ecotourism, hunting. So we looked at these examples and we thought, how can we use this to see how to harness the opportunities available for developing countries? As you know, ITC works directly with exporters, producers, and cooperatives, and in this context, we have actually done a few projects which can give very practical examples of how to harness this limitative environment or sustainable environment conditions with products that already exist in the countries. So, for example, in Madagascar, we have offered capacity building to Women's Association in Makira Forest on climate-resilient raffia. Raffia is already produced, and it is climate-resilient production. It was a matter of promoting that production and linking it to international market to enable these women to have income. In Peru, we are working with cacao suppliers on sustainable sourcing practices and promoting market access with fine and aromatic chocolate producers in Europe. In Kenya, and in response to increasing demand from retailers and private standard setters about reducing carbon emission in production, ITC worked with 16 tea factories to improve energy efficiency and reduce firewood consumption. This has enabled the factories to comply with climate labeling. So not only they have been able to comply with a specific certificate required by the buyer, but it also satisfy requirement from buyers, but also secure market access and strengthen their competitiveness due to substantial energy cost saving. Beyond the agricultural sector, ITC has been working with the textile industry in Tunisia to introduce clean production techniques for more efficient use of water and energy to enable these products to be more competitive. So these are a few examples of how can we use existing industries or existing production, make it more environmentally friendly, and introduce some competitiveness factors for the countries to be able to sell more in the international market. In addition to that, we have been working for the last few years on the transparency to trade, and in that sense we have developed Standards Map, which is a database of private voluntary standards that enables comparison of principles and criteria, as well as enabling exporters to benchmark their business against standards and compliance. So all the environment standards will probably be voluntary standards. We have actually captured this information in a database that is accessible to everyone, so people can be informed of what are the exigencies or the requirements and how they can conform to it, or maybe contest it if it is really against their products. However, I think one important point that was made by the speakers before me, which is to really be able to harness these opportunities, we have to do more work on removing tariffs, barriers to trade, in tariffs or non-tariffs. According to our analysis, the average tariffs on environmental goods imported into developing countries range from 3 to 11%, and in some countries the tariffs go up to 20%. So by reducing the tariffs and non-tariffs and facilitating the flow of environmental goods and services, we will be able to better use the climate change constraints or the climate change requirements, and in terms of adaptation and mitigation, to the benefit of developing countries. Part of this scheme is also the services that are an important part of this part of all the trade in the environment area, which are often packaged with environmental goods and often face significant non-tariff barriers. In conclusion, we think that climate change presents challenges as well as opportunities for international trade. The linkages at the level of policies have not clearly been analyzed in depth, and a lot of work still needs to be done. However, we have to ensure that the challenges are overcome and that the developing countries can harness the new opportunities based on their comparative advantage. Thank you very much.
Thanks to Ms. Lilia for this highlighting the role of trade data and information, of monitoring the contribution from the trade sector in general globally to the climate change. And now I'm just a bit concerned about time, and we need to rush as we have another session, so we'll try to restructure the time so we benefit the audience the most. Let me call upon Mr. Jalal bin Hayoun. He is from Moroccan Portnet, which is, I understand, is a single window structure for trade support within the kingdom. Please.
Good morning, everybody. My presentation will be in French. Donc, bonjour tout le monde. Ce que je vais essayer de faire à travers cette présentation, c'est un petit peu de vous donner la position du Maroc par rapport à la vision, par rapport à la croissance verte, et essayer de vous prouver en quelques slides à travers une étude qu'on a menée que la dématérialisation, l'optimisation des procédures peut être un bon levier de croissance verte, parce que je suis convaincu qu'aucune des entreprises ne tient vraiment au papier, ne tient vraiment au déplacement d'une façon inutile s'il trouve des solutions de remplacement. Donc, à travers une étude qui a été faite par le cabinet du Gartner, donc les entreprises dilapident plus de 2% de leur chiffre d'affaires dans la gestion interne du papier. On va le voir dans un slide après. Donc, la gestion du papier au niveau de l'entreprise peut venir à travers l'achat du papier, le courrier, le transport, les autres sources. Et puis en interne, comme vous le savez, au quotidien, tout dépend aujourd'hui, tous les process au niveau de l'entreprise dépendent du papier, parce qu'il n'y a pas de solution de remplacement, il n'y a pas des choses qu'on peut faire autrement. Donc, et puis donc, à la sortie, donc, l'entreprise est toujours otage du papier, que ce soit pour envoyer des courriers à l'extérieur, le papier peut être détruit, recyclé, ou surtout pour effectuer des procédures. Dans notre cadre, quand on parle du commerce extérieur, où le papier est exigé dans un petit peu dans toutes les fenêtres où l'entreprise est tenue d'y aller. Donc il y a plusieurs niveaux de dématérialisation qui peuvent être amis de la croissance verte. On peut favoriser les échanges électroniques, c'est ce qu'on essaie de faire les entreprises à travers l'implémentation des systèmes automatisés. On peut mettre des systèmes de workflow justement pour automatiser même la prise de décision et ne pas être obligé de signer sur un papier. On peut adopter aussi l'archivage électronique au lieu de l'archivage papier, qui est une vraie contrainte légale pour les entreprises. Et aujourd'hui, c'est possible de le faire parce que toutes les solutions et l'arsenal juridique le permet, comme la dématérialisation totale à l'entrée et à la sortie de tous les process. Et c'est ce qu'on va présenter à travers cette présentation. Donc, Portnet, comme vous le savez, donc c'est le guichet unique national du commerce extérieur, donc un petit peu qui opérationnalise la politique du gouvernement marocain, de toute la communauté du commerce extérieur, visant à la simplification, l'optimisation des process de l'import à l'export. Vous voyez un petit peu le déroulement depuis le sourcing des opérations commerciales et jusqu'au la création de valeur, le paiement et le reporting réglementaire auprès de toutes les administrations. Donc c'est un système aujourd'hui qui englobe plus de 20 000 clients, donc à peu près de 26 000 utilisateurs, et qui regroupe tous les partenaires, toutes les parties prenantes du commerce extérieur, plus de 16 banques, une dizaine d'administrations, donc, et puis tous les transitaires, en tout cas tous les acteurs qui interviennent de près ou de loin dans la chaîne du commerce à l'international. Donc c'est un système qui a permis concrètement au Maroc de faire un vrai saut qualitatif dans la gestion du commerce transfrontalier. Donc l'une des dernières reconnaissances, donc, dans le rapport du Doing Business dans 2017, là il y a une coquille. Le Maroc a pu améliorer son score Doing Business, et puis notamment justement à ce qui a été fait au niveau de la rubrique commerce transfrontalier, puisqu'on a gagné 39 places. On est parti de la 101e position justement à la 63e place. Donc justement a été stipulé clairement dans le rapport que c'est dû notamment à la mise en œuvre et la généralisation du système de guichet unique, justement, qui a permis de simplifier l'importation et l'exportation. Donc c'est un système justement à travers les process dématérialisés implémentés qui permet l'optimisation de tous les process du commerce extérieur et qui permet aussi l'intégration avec les systèmes de gestion ou les systèmes d'information au niveau des entreprises quand il s'agit de gestion des process à l'import et l'export. Parce que comme vous savez, on a besoin d'imprimer le papier quand il y a une rupture de la chaîne automatisée du traitement au niveau de l'entreprise, quand on sort d'un ERP, quand on sort d'un WMS, quand on voudrait aller chez une administration, quand on voudrait aller vers un prestataire externe. C'est là où on a besoin du papier. Et puis avant la mise en œuvre de ce système, on avait une sorte de spaghetti qui caractérise les échanges qui sont effectués entre l'ensemble des parties prenantes, que ce soit fournisseurs de services publics ou privés qui agissent dans le commerce extérieur. Aujourd'hui, on a un point central qui centralise tous les échanges et permet ainsi d'optimiser cette relation d'échange entre les parties prenantes. Donc à travers une étude très courte qu'on a essayé de faire et qui peut être justement poussée, on a essayé de nous limiter à un périmètre bien défini. On s'est limité à un certain nombre de documents qui sont la gestion du titre d'importation, la licence d'exportation, quelques documents douaniers maritimes qui sont gérés au niveau de Portnet, tels que le manifeste et la DUM, et puis l'inspection coordonnée des marchandises au niveau des ports. Donc cette étude ne va pas très loin puisqu'il ne couvre pas plusieurs process qui sont très consommateurs en termes de papier et aujourd'hui qui sont automatisés, qui ont permis, l'exemple que je vais donner, c'est l'exemple des banques aujourd'hui qui sont tenues à effectuer un reporting réglementaire auprès de l'office d'échange et qui étaient des chambres de papier, pleines de papier, qui sont données à une administration. Aujourd'hui, ce n'est plus fait, puisque tout ce process est effectué d'une façon dématérialisée à travers le guichet unique, sans que la banque y intervienne. Donc là, on va partir à quelques hypothèses. Pour la production d'une tonne de papier, l'équivalent de 400 ramettes, on a besoin de plusieurs choses. On a besoin de plus de 26 000 litres d'eau. On a besoin de 17 arbres donc, qui vont disparaître pour produire ces ramettes. On a besoin d'un équivalent de 4100 kW par heure d'électricité. Et ça, justement, on a besoin de 3 barils de pétrole et ça dégage 3 mètres cubes de déchets. Donc ça, c'est une hypothèse de base qu'on a trouvée. C'est les études scientifiques qui le disent. Donc aussi, une opération de commerce extérieur, en fait, d'une procédure à effectuer auprès d'une administration, que ce soit pour une déclaration, que ce soit pour une démarche, nécessite la production d'un dossier papier constitué d'une moyenne de 5 feuilles à faire circuler entre 2 administrations par une distance et traverser une distance de 4 km. On a essayé d'être très conservateur au niveau de cette étude parce que la réalité est une autre chose quand il s'agit de dossiers. Quand il s'agit du titre d'importation, on a des dossiers de plusieurs centaines de pages à faire voyager d'une ville à une autre ou autrement. Donc, à travers cette étude, là, on va présenter les résultats par rapport à chaque rubrique, par rapport à la dématérialisation de chaque document, et puis on va présenter le résultat global. Donc, rien qu'à par rapport à la dématérialisation du titre d'importation, donc un volume de transactions qui existait avant cette dématérialisation de 500 000 titres d'importation qui sont traités manuellement et qui voyageaient entre plusieurs administrations, plusieurs banques, ainsi de suite. Cette démarche de dématérialisation au niveau national et d'une façon exclusive nous a permis d'épargner 212 000 arbres, 500, d'épargner 331 250 litres d'eau douce, justement d'épargner la consommation d'électricité de 51 millions kilowatts par heure d'électricité, l'équivalent de 35 700 barils de pétrole, et justement d'éviter l'émission de CO2 de 8 millions kilogrammes et d'éviter la production de déchets équivalent de 37 000 mètres cubes de déchets. Donc, par rapport à la dématérialisation de la licence d'exportation, qui est un document qui est utilisé pas avec la même fréquence que le titre d'importation, ça nous a permis justement, sur la même base de calcul, d'économiser ce qui suit. Donc on va passer rapidement pour passer aux résultats finaux. Donc ça c'est la dématérialisation des documents douaniers et maritimes. Donc à travers notre plateforme aujourd'hui, la gestion des escales des navires au niveau de tous les ports du royaume se font d'une façon dématérialisée. Donc il y avait plusieurs centaines de documents que les agents maritimes, qui sont les représentants des propriétaires de navires, devaient déposer auprès de plusieurs administrations. Souvent, c'est les mêmes documents qui sont déposés. Il y a une étude qui a été faite par le Conseil national du commerce extérieur dans les années 2000 et qui dit que ces documents-là sont échangés en moyenne 7 fois et qui sont donnés auprès de toutes les administrations. Les résultats de cette dématérialisation nous permettent de préserver 96 000 arbres, de 150 000 millions de litres d'eau douce, 23 millions kilowatts par heure d'électricité, 17 000 barils de pétrole, 4 millions de kilogrammes de CO2 et de 17 000 mètres carrés de déchets. La dématérialisation des fiches suiveuses. Les fiches suiveuses sont un document aujourd'hui qui permet une gestion coordonnée et de toute l'inspection physique nécessaire au niveau d'un port ou au niveau d'un aéroport entre l'ensemble des organismes de contrôle et la douane. C'est un document électronique aujourd'hui. Donc, au lieu d'effectuer une inspection d'une façon planifiée manuellement auprès de chaque administration, aujourd'hui, cette inspection est effectuée d'une façon coordonnée entre plusieurs administrations de contrôle ainsi que l'administration des douanes en introduisant un rendez-vous qui est coordonné au niveau de Portnet. Le résultat, justement, c'est de préserver 435 000 arbres, donc l'équivalent de 678 millions de litres d'eau douce, donc d'éviter la consommation de 104 millions de kilowatts par heure d'électricité, l'équivalent de 76 000 barils de pétrole, donc éviter l'émission de 2 millions, plus de 2 millions de kilogrammes de CO2 et la génération de 76 000 mètres cubes de déchets. Là, on arrive aussi à un point qui est très important, qui est relatif à un système qui a été mis en place au niveau de cette plateforme de guichet unique et qui permet aujourd'hui une gestion anticipée et une gestion intelligente de tous les risques qui peuvent produire à partir d'un navire qui risque d'avoir un incident et qui risque d'attendre auprès d'un port au niveau de la rade pour faire l'escale. Et l'impact environnemental de cette gestion est très 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 importante. Là, ça n'a pas fait partie de cette étude, et ce n'est pas chiffré, mais le gain il est vraiment énorme. Là, on arrive au résultat global de cette étude. Donc, la démarche de dématérialisation a permis au Maroc d'économiser l'équivalent de la consommation annuelle de 7 735 foyers en termes d'eau douce, l'équivalent de 42 000 foyers en termes d'électricité et 15 700 foyers en termes de déchets, de déchets qui sont évités. Donc ça permet aussi d'épargner 800 000 arbres, c'est la taille de la forêt de Grunwald en Allemagne, et ça a permis d'économiser l'équivalent de la consommation annuelle de carburant de 17 000 voitures. Donc l'impact il est énorme, rien que par rapport à quelques documents. Si l'étude est poussée, donc on peut se rendre compte que des choses qui sont vraiment magnifiques. Donc, si on estime aujourd'hui qu'on est à 50% de dématérialisation, on peut imaginer ce qui peut être fait à terme quand on finalisera tout ce process. Là, on peut justement éviter la consommation d'eau d'équivalent de 30 900 foyers, l'équivalent de 168 000 foyers en termes de consommation d'électricité et une réduction de production de déchets d'équivalent de 62 900 foyers. Donc, merci de votre attention.
Thanks, Mr. Jalal bin Hayoun from Portnet of Morocco, and showing the other side of automation and how much we reduce on the emissions and contribution to climate change through automation. I think one of the questions that you might need to find an answer to with the audiences later on when we have the discussions is the contribution on the negative side of using energy to keep all these servers cool to be able to run. So this is another aspect that's not added to the equation, as Dr. Robert earlier told us about the whole equations. So I have to manage the time. We have another session, or I have another side event that's coming after these two sessions. So I would like to apologize from the audiences. We'll have discussions, but after the second session. I want to start immediately the second one. I would like to call the audiences to please remain. That one will make it very short and will change the format quickly. So that we can have the discussions later on with all these topics since they are related. We're moving on to the finance, sustainable finance for climate change. And I want to call, first I would like to apologize that Mr. Andrew Hyam from the Mission 2020 has not been able to make it in the last minute. I would like to call, it's okay, Mr. Jeremy Tegger, the Senior Advisor of Impact Alpha, and Mr. Thomas Van Hein, the Senior Program Manager for Banking Environment Initiative, as well as Mr. Zito Alfayo, the Manager at Project Finance and Export Development, African Export-Import Bank. I'm just trying to quickly name, maybe change the game as I learned from the first session, so you will be penalized for not having the same luxury we did before. I would like to, I ask the assistants to avail mics so you can speak from your place. But I also wanted the interventions basically to address directly what the specific institutions' efforts on the climate change and try to keep it as short as possible so we have some time for the discussions. You can still address some of the issues later on with the discussion. The collaborators has informed me that Mr. Andrew Hyam is not coming. So do we have a representative for Andrew? No. Okay, so let us start with Mr. Jeremy from the Impact Alpha to maybe directly go into the
He's going to moderate.
Okay. So I can hand over to.
Yeah, you can hand over to me.
That's fine.
Okay.
Sorry, so that, you can just take it up, but we just have basically half an hour to try and wrap up and conclude by the end. So we wanted to really make our interventions as short as possible. We have another side event that will be kicking off shortly. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We've got a brief to be brief and interesting, and I'm hopeful that we can do that. My name's Elliot Whittington. I'm from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, which is a part of the University of Cambridge that works with business, finance, policymakers to explore the major challenges that the world is facing and how leaders can engage with those challenges. And my role is indeed engaging around climate change policy and the role of businesses in shaping that. I'm very, very pleased to be joined by a very informed panel. And I'll introduce you to them, and we can talk a little bit at the top here in terms of the links between trade finance and sustainability and climate change in particular. And then we'll try and do that for maybe about 20 minutes and then have 10 minutes so we can get some questions from the audience and find out what you're really interested in terms of unpacking things. So, if I talk through the panel, so on my left, we've got Mr. Zito Alfayo, who is from the African Export-Import Bank. He works in the Project Finance Department, has worked on a huge number of sectors in terms of both hard infrastructure, heavy industry, transport, logistics, health, ICT, and education, and is an expert in project finance. On my right, I have Thomas Verhagen, who is a colleague of mine at Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, but indeed works closely with some of the major banks through the Banking Environment Initiative that we run, and that builds on his experience as a former employee of ABN AMRO, and deep expertise in terms of both project finance but also innovation and how to bring some of the sustainability elements to bear on those topics. And then on the far right I have Jerome Tagger, who is an independent expert who has advised all sorts of financial institutions. He's worked with the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, and also has been a director at the Global Impact Investment Network. So we've got a range of perspectives around the table, and we're going to talk to you about the links between trade finance and climate change and sustainability. And that indeed is where I'm going to start. And I'm going to start with Jerome. And I'm going to ask you to if you could talk a bit about why what you see those links as being, why you see trade finance and sustainability as being a conversation that's important to have.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Bonjour. It's a pleasure to be here. I think what's interesting is if we take a step back, there's been a lot of efforts by different types of investors and financial organizations in the world to develop practices around sustainability. They might be called responsible investing, they might be called impact investing, they might be called sustainable investing, and each speak in different ways to different actors of the financial chain. And in that sense also to different tools and instruments that they can use to address their challenges. In many ways, trade finance has been I'd say the second consideration in many of these instances. At first, these institutions have looked at how they can deploy their investment capital in businesses and otherwise in support of environmental and social goals. What's interesting is that there's a junction of two factors right here. If we think about the field as a whole, there's one which is the environment and sustainability in that sense, in the sense of what this conference represents. On the other hand, we have the development agenda, and the development agenda means helping populations, low-income populations, populations in emerging markets develop sustainable means of living. And these two have converged in many ways to create different approaches to sustainable finance. And in that vein, the trade finance agenda, I think, has come primarily from a development angle, particularly with small organizations that have been wanting to support smallholder farmers, particularly in soft commodities, cocoa, coffee, in pockets of the world, and so help these populations first, and then second layer considerations of the environment and of environmental sustainability around them. On the other hand, you have large organizations which be typically development finance institutions like the IFC and say FMO in the Netherlands, to take two examples. These have worked both with the renewables and the energy sector on the one hand, but also the agricultural sector on the other hand, to support them in development and in adopting a variety of these practices.
Thank you. So I'm going to pass to Zito. From the perspective of the Afrex-Imbank, or however you're supposed to pronounce that, can you talk about why an institution like yours is engaging in this subject? What you're looking for from that space? And also, can you talk a bit about what the fit is between trade finance and sustainability, why that's a good fit?
Thank you very much, Elliot. First and foremost, I'll start by giving a brief overview of the African Export-Import Bank and what we do. Essentially, the African Export-Import Bank is the Trade Finance Bank of Africa. We are represented in 42 member states, and our primary mandate is intervene in facilitating and enabling trade in Africa. Essentially, what we look at is putting together and facilitating intra-African trade. We have done quite a bit in this space, and as we speak, 70% of our portfolio, out of the 10 billion odd that we have as our asset base, is actually geared towards the SME and corporate finance space. As in line with our mandate as a DFI, we do note that over and above ensuring sustainable development, we do look and see that having an enabling and sustainable environment is very important. Given that most of the companies in which we intervene in are in the SME sector, we're of the view that we need to, first and foremost, ensure that we have products and services that are aligned to this particular role. We at Afrexim Bank, first and foremost, are coming up with innovative ways and interventions to tap into this space. Currently, we are configured as a wholesale lender. So in essentially what we do is that we do get lines of credit from international institutions and on lend to financial institutions that are in country. We do note that most trade finance transactions tend to be a bit small and hence cannot directly access the African Export-Import Bank. But what we do is that we do avail lines of credit to financial institutions that are in country, and we are striving and endeavoring to ensure that we do come up with eligibility criteria for SMEs that can actually tap into the African Export-Import Bank. Having said that, we are also keen on ensuring that we do position SMEs and corporates into the regional and global value chains worldwide. We are of the view that this actually adds value and ensures that there's retention of money and value addition within the continent. So in essence, what we are trying to do is, first and foremost, source for competitively priced funds, and some of the particular stakeholders we're looking to have meetings with are actually in this particular forum. Secondly, we are looking at and playing an advocacy role whereby we can actually talk to financial institutions in the continent, align our interests alongside with theirs, and avail particular interventions in terms of lines of credit, guarantees, and other instruments that will enable intervention in trade finance institutions. We're also looking at working alongside institutions that are offshore and beyond Africa that are keen to take on African risk to actually avail funding through the African Export-Import Bank, given our credit rating, to intervene in the continent. Thank you.
Thank you. And Thomas, so we've heard a little bit about a sort of institutional approach from a development bank side of things. Perhaps from your perspective, in terms of working with private sector entities, you can talk about what the drivers and incentives are for some of the big international banks to engage in this space and where they're seeing potential. And just before you answer that, just to note for the rest of the panel that it sounds like we've got a little bit extra time, so we can take our time a bit more. So, but yeah, okay.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you to the ITFC for having us here. It's a great pleasure. I work for the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, just as Elliot. He's my colleague, and I run a platform of commercial banks there. It's called the Banking Environment Initiative, and it consists of some of the bigger banks in the world. So Standard Chartered, Barclays Bank, Santander, BNP Paribas, and in total 11 commercial banks. These banks work on sustainable trade finance, and the reason that we at the BEI work on sustainable trade finance is that we see that there's a demand of clients of the bank, and there's a need from a risk management perspective from the bank. So we see that the stakeholders of the banks, be they clients, be they institutional investors, and be they the regulators in various geographies in the world, have an increased focus on the risks and opportunities which come with climate change. And we think that specifically trade finance is one of the leverage points which can offer an above average contribution to mitigate climate change. And perhaps I can explain really briefly why we think that that is the case. We've done some research with the people at the China Banking Regulatory Commission, which is the regulator of all of China. We work a lot with this institution. And one of our findings was that the type of commodities, the traded commodities, which we currently focus on, which are soft commodities, that they, on average, have the highest embedded greenhouse gas emissions of all commodities imported in China. So if you want to have an impact, like I think most of the people who are present here today during COP22, if you want to have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to have a couple of options to choose from. But I think that working on sustainable trade finance is a very, very valid and very good option to choose.
Do you want to try this one?
Yeah. pass it back to you in a second. Try again? Okay. Jerome, now it's gone very loud. Building off Thomas's point, we heard about the interest in terms of soft commodities, and you've talked about earlier in terms of the experience you've got in terms of engaging with farmers. Can you talk about the impact investment case, building on what you were saying earlier about the benefits of climate and development coming together?
Sure, and I think there's a number of them. In the smallholder farmer context, and we're talking, so about 2.5 billion people on Earth live in rural areas, and the vast majority of them work and subsist from agriculture. The challenge is manifold. On the one hand, it's about looking at what kind of livelihood they can have and the impact of that on the environment. And the second is, on the other hand, is looking at how their livelihood can become sustainable, and again the impact of that on the environment. So when people don't have access to finance, to the resources that help them build a certain degree of sustainability in their lives, then they rely, and they have to rely on living practices that may not be environmentally friendly, like slash and burn type agriculture, and that has got a huge environmental cost. When, on the other hand, banks and other impact type funds help them through providing trade finance and other tools, it allows them to make their livelihood more sustainable, and in return, it makes their own business more sustainable. So the impact is both at the onset on the environment and then in medium term in helping these people enter a more sustainable approach to living. And what's interesting is really that we're talking about financing solutions that don't necessarily exist and that don't exist on a large scale. We're talking about people who don't have access to microfinance. They're too big for microfinance. They're too small for commercial banks most of the time. They're commonly referred to as the missing middle. And in large parts of the world, even there would not be either of those microfinance institutions or commercial banks to support them. So that all the more emphasizes the importance of all financial actors coming to grips with these questions. Thank you.
And one of the points that came out very strongly there, and indeed in the conversation so far, is this issue about scale. So, you know, this scale that's going up from very big financial institutions down to SMEs and smallholder farmers on the ground. Zito, perhaps I can come to you on that front in terms of what your thinking is in terms of how the value chain needs to be constructed to be able to bridge that gulf of scale.
Thank you. First and foremost, I'll just take a step back and look at the African Export-Import Bank business model. As we are currently configured, our minimum lending is approximately $10 million. So you'll note that given the amount that we're looking at, not many SMEs can tap into the bank or directly access lines of credit from the bank. However, we work closely with financial institutions in the continent who are in our position to on-lend the funds that were available to them to tap into this particular sector. What we're also doing is that we are ensuring that in our facilities that we do avail to this particular financial institutions, that they do tap and actually ensure that they on-lend to this missing middle, as was rightly pointed out by Jerome. We ensure that we have monitoring covenants to ensure that this particular market is tapped into, first and foremost. Secondly, what we're also doing, and we do note that, looking at the bottom up, we do know that once you tap into the SMEs and avail trade finance solutions, that is the best way to ensure that you've got sustainable development and environmental impact, and ensures that the bank actually meets the triple bottom line, which is in line with our mandate. So what we do as a bank, given that we have a key role in disseminating this information and ensuring that institutions can come up to speed on these practices, first and foremost, we work closely with international organizations such as the International Cocoa Organization. We work with the Cashew Nut Organization in pulling together these small farmers, ensuring that we provide key interventions to ensure that they have market access. But also in facilitating this, we do educate them and bring them up to speed on why they should pursue safe and clean environmental practices so as to ensure that they do not actually pursue initiatives that will result in harming the environment. I'll also talk to some of the key opportunities we see in this particular area. We do note that this is a new area, and we're all learning from some of the initiatives that have taken place. We're partnering with institutions such as the IFC, the World Bank, etc., to come up with innovative solutions and ensure that we do get competitive funding. You'll also know that as a bank, as much as we're willing to lend money, we need to make sure that we do get a return and we do get our money back. So we're trying to see how we can get competitively priced funds that will also ensure that the ultimate goal, that is the SMEs and the trade finance institutions that actually access this funding, they'll be able to ensure that they do get a financial return, first and foremost, to make it viable for themselves and also to repay the bank. These discussions are currently ongoing, and we're talking to different stakeholders, and we look forward to hearing from them, some of whom at this particular forum, and we'll be taking up these discussions with them. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to come to Thomas with a question, but before I do, I'm going to say we have a few more things we can discuss on the panel, but I'd actually really like to hear from the audience what you would like to discuss. So I'm going to give you fair warning. I'm going to come to you and ask if you've got questions in a second. But before I do, I'm going to go to Thomas and say, so we've sort of heard this case. We've heard about the value in terms of what it can achieve and how you can deliver a mandate and how it can tackle particularly impact on soft commodities and the footprint there. So what are the barriers to kind of achieving some of this vision that we've set out? What things could we change that would help scale up and deliver some of the aspirations that we've been talking about?
Yeah, thank you, Elliot. Yeah, some of the barriers we currently see are barriers of access. And when I'm talking about barriers of access, it's one of the points Zito just made and Jerome made about the missing middle. How do you reach those companies and those producers on the ground? That's a big barrier. Another barrier has to do with not just the risks of this financing, but also with the capacity building. An example is that with the BEI, we have something called the Sustainable Trade Finance Council, which is a group of leading banks. They want to lead in sustainable trade finance, and they developed a concept called the Sustainable Shipment Letter of Credit, which is a sustainability product. We developed that, and it would be very beneficial to, for example, local clients and local banks in Indonesia. But what we see in practice is that these banks and clients don't know about this product. They don't know about the facilities which are being offered by multilateral development banks. They don't know about the innovation. And that's why these innovations are not being tested at the moment. I think there's a very big opportunity for all of us here in the room to make sure that if there are smart ideas and there are smart new developments all over the world, to work together and make sure that we reach the right people to test whether these smart ideas are actually adding value or not, and if not, how to improve them. So that's one barrier we very clearly see. Some other barriers there are is questions of definitions. So what is sustainable? What is green? How do we get to a consensus on that so we can include it in financial products? That's another question we have. There's many more questions, but then that will keep you from asking your questions, so I'm not going to filibuster you here. But these are some examples.
Thank you. Okay, so questions from the room. Have we got any? Can I see some hands? Anybody? Oh, yeah. Do we have any roving microphones? We do. Perhaps somebody can... So the gentleman in the middle just here, if you can come round. And when the microphone gets to you, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and explaining what organisation you're from.
Bonjour, je suis Mansour Chern, je viens de la Tunisie, d'une ONG. D'accord, merci. Je suis Chern Mansour, je suis de la Tunisie, je viens d'une ONG qui se trouve dans 156 pays. Tout ce qui a été dit ici bien. Mais j'ai une petite question. Quelle est la part de vos financements dans le développement des énergies renouvelables par rapport aux énergies fossiles en pourcentage? Merci.
Okay. I think that's a question most straightforwardly aimed at you, Zito. Can you give us an answer on that? Did you get that question? Yeah.
Yes. We at the African Export-Import Bank initially started off as a trade finance bank. I'm from the project infrastructure division. And in the last 2 to 3 years, we've actually been availing what we call project finance solutions. And currently, we've got an exposure of about 5 to 10% in our portfolio that is made up of renewable energy. We're looking at growing that up. We're talking to various stakeholders to get various lines of credit to ensure that we're in a position to intervene even more. We're very keen on this particular product, and we're keen to partner with potential developers and stakeholders to intervene. Thank you.
Did you want to come in?
So I'm not from a financing institution myself, but I do want to point to a couple of examples to put this in perspective in a practical way. Some of the institutions addressing this, particularly in the DFI sector. One is FMO, so the Dutch DFI, I mentioned them earlier. And the way they approach this is that they have set impact objectives for their financing activities. And they have 2 of them. It's very simple. They want to, I think it's their Agenda 2020. They want to double the number of jobs they create and half their carbon footprint. And I think that's a very valuable way to look at it from a portfolio perspective. The other one I want to bring up is the IFC. And so the IFC has a global trade financing program in which they work with financial partners to offer guarantees to facilitate trade. So at that level, they work with the financial institutions. And in this context, under this program, the IFC has created something called Climate Smart. And Climate Smart is essentially a set of questions that they ask to enable these institutions that are looking at financing climate-efficient products, equipment, or renewable energies. And that allows the IFC to provide them with better terms for the financing, whether it's longer tenors or better rates. So that's not direct. This one is not directly answering your question, but I want to talk. I mentioned this because I think it's important to look at the ways that these institutions are putting mechanics in place to help them move towards those goals.
Thank you for your question. Even though we focus on soft commodities, if you look at the trade finance, the question you ask, I think, is a very important, a very big one. And the way I understand it, it relates to how banks, commercial banks, but also multilateral development banks, can go through a transition, through a change from the economy as it is and their portfolios as it is towards a new economy and a new portfolio. And the difficulty in that is that we don't yet know what that new economy is going to be like, or what that new portfolio is going to be like. So what I hear when I talk to the members of the BEI, the banks, what I hear is that they recognize that a change is at hand. They can identify the biggest risks. Some of the biggest risks currently for our member banks are in coal production, in coal trade. But they don't know yet what the winners are going to be. So one of the thoughts in the back of their minds, which they share with me, is how can we navigate this transition? How can we move through this transition to the new state, the new situation? And they don't have an answer to that yet. And you can't swap overnight. That, it needs to be a transition. It's not like a light button. So that's one of the big challenges we currently see with our members. And we work on that through the BEI on these transitions as well. I noticed that Jerome wants to share something. Yeah.
No, I know this is stimulating my thinking. I think that points to a very interesting question and problem, solvable problem to address for the sector. which is who's thinking about the problem and what problem are you trying to address here? How do you match the solutions with the problems in a certain word? So at a macro level, a global financial institution may be making certain bets or raising certain questions about the risks and the bets of the future and so on. At a local level, those questions are very different because they're really driven by what's possible on the ground. So if you are in a country thinking about your energy mix, thinking about how you're going to grow the trade of your company, you're not thinking about it in the abstract, you're thinking about it in very concrete terms. And the challenge there is to find the right interlocutor, the right person to speak with, that is in a position to understand your problems and your questions, but also to have the appropriate financing tools in place to support that. And there's no magic stick, right? There's no hey, this panel has figured out what sustainable finance would be and then we implement it. No, there's some very concrete implications and very practical implications in the ways that this thinking has repercussions and is implemented on the ground. And it's really, at that point, about the reality, about the actors that are there, about the banks, about the international financing institutions, about the investors, and about the field that they're in.
Thank you. So any further questions? Okay, gentlemen, we'll maybe even take a group. So I've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, we'll take each of those. If you could say, your name and where you're from, that would be very helpful.
Thank you. I am the director. I am from the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I am DG of a subsidiary organ like ITC in Geneva, called ICDT. Unfortunately, we didn't have the chance to discuss the first panel. It was a very the scene was put at the first panel, and the major discussion was about the policy options and the options to mitigate climate change, especially from UNCTAD and ITC. And we had many scenarios, but in my humble view, the scenario about soft tools and reward and incentives is the most feasible for the time being. We can't force and command and by decree change the world. After the election in USA, you heard about the maybe new position of the new administration. So it's early to decide, and banks cannot decide now because we are in moving situation, in transition situation. But I think that the first mover in strategy, the first mover will catch the main, I think, benefit. And you have the first mover and followers. In general, 2/3 are followers and only 1/3 or 20% are first mover. I think that multilateral financial institution will be the first mover. I mean, World Bank, you cannot attend commercial bank in Africa and Arab countries to move to green trade finance.
So do you have a particular question for the panel?
Yes, please. It's a comment. It's a comment, not a question.
Okay.
If I have a question, are you followers or first mover?
Okay, that's a good question. That's a nice, meaty question. If we take the other two questions, so the gentleman with the beard and
I'm Luis from the Amazon Natural Capital Institute. So I was wondering what sort of mechanisms or methodologies African banks currently have in place to measure the social and environmental impacts of the projects you approve. If you make use of internationally recognized standards such as the IFC's performance standard, or you design bespoke standards or methodologies for African institutions or cooperatives or
okay.
etc.
That's a very good, clear question. And then I think there was the gentleman just front, and we'll take another round of questions after this. But we'll take this one and then we'll go to the panel.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Je parle français. Bon, je suis Samuel Chaib, je suis étudiant en doctorat à la Université du Stade. Mon question, c'est s'il n'y a pas des opportunités ou des possibilités d'accompagner les jeunes chercheurs, entrepreneurs pendant la phase de réalisation et de création de leur entreprise. Mais il y a pas mal des étudiants qui ont travaillé sur les domaines de l'énergie renouvelable, la microbiologie, qui ont des prototypes très importants au niveau de l'environnement. Bon, ma question, c'est il y a des opportunités de suivre et de réaliser ce projet-là au niveau de votre projet. Et merci.
Okay, so that's 3 very good questions. So are you a first mover, or are the organisations you work with a first mover or a follower? What do banks, and particularly African banks, have the right kind of indicators and metrics? And are we doing enough to support the entrepreneurs? I'm going to start, Zito, with you, because I think a lot of that's aimed at you, but we'll also get thoughts from the other panelists.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, on the question of are we followers or fast movers? We, as a DFI, do work alongside some of these actually all the multilateral development institutions. So we all work together because these institutions are not in a position to intervene in all places, not in a position to intervene globally all at once. So some of these challenges are actually passed on to some of the institutions that are more closer on the ground in a better position to intervene given their local knowledge and an understanding. So yes, we do move together, and in a sense, we're all fast movers. Secondly, what are some of the monitoring covenants that are in place? We do have covenants which we have to adhere to and which we pass on to particular financial institutions and companies that borrow from the bank. And these are clearly laid out from the outset when they do approach the various financial institutions. So these are in form of, first and foremost, jobs created, the quality of jobs created. We look at what the environmental impact is in terms of, are they saving on the carbon emissions? Are they substituting or having a technology transfer which will assist? So these are clearly laid out up front, and we do have matrices that we follow through on. Thank you.
Can I invite comments from the other two?
Well, again, because I'm not from a financial institution, it's hard for me to say if I'm a leader or a follower. But I've spent the last 15 years of my life trying to have more financial institutions become leaders. And all I can say is there's great pleasures, but also a ton of frustration, and it never goes fast enough. On the impact measurement front, I think. Obviously, in the DFI world, there's a wide adoption of the IFC performance standards. There are other frameworks that are developed in the sustainable trade world, for example, by an organization called FAST, the Alliance. Can't remember F, but Alliance for Sustainable Trade, my former organization, Global Impact Investing Network, has created a tool called IRIS. Which is a catalog of environmental and social performance metrics with the objective of getting wide adoption across the financing chain of those metrics as a basis for the creation of performance standards. And I recommend looking at IRIS because, first of all, it's interesting in and of itself, but it's also a source of additional information on how organizations around the world, across sectors, not just necessarily trade, are addressing impact measurement.
Great. Thomas, given your background in innovation, do you want to comment on this question about whether we're doing enough to support young job-creating entrepreneurs, or whether the right support systems are in place from a finance perspective?
Yeah, well, the way I used to be in the lending business, and when we used to lend money to entrepreneurs, but these entrepreneurs always needed to have a track record, cash flows, in order to be eligible and to meet the criteria for the lending, and that's what old-fashioned banking is about. At least that's what I always learned. Need a track record in order to be able to finance a loan, at least with a bank. As soon as we are looking at more newer developments, new technologies, new business models, which could contribute to solving some of the questions which are there. The risks increase from a banking risk management perspective because it's not been proven yet. Quite often there's not enough track record. That doesn't mean that it's not financeable, but normally it would be equity investors, angel investors, seed funds, venture capital funds. So it would be a different class of financier which focuses on these type of investments. So that's what I can share. And so my constituency, my group of banks, they mainly focus on the lending part or on the financial markets intermediary part. Less so on venture capital, angel investing, those type of things.
Okay.
Perhaps we need more of that, you know? I recognize that, yeah.
So, I'm going to try and do one last round of questions. Who has a question? I think there's a gentleman over there. Before we hear from you, sir, can I just see, have we got any other hands? Have we got anybody else who wants to ask questions? This is probably the last round. We've got a gentleman there. Anybody over this side at all? Okay, so we'll take these two questions. Oh, and the gentleman there. We'll take the three questions.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Emile Bella. My name is Emile Bella from the West African Civil Society Forum, WACSOF. I just wanted to focus on the private financing of adaptations and bank as private entities. I would like to know what exactly do you have a strategy or mechanism that is put in place in terms of supporting or maybe contributing to financing adaptation. And especially from the perspective of civil society, I just wanted to know if you have a kind of partnership that you develop with a private sector, civil society organization toward contributing to a financing adaptation mechanism that you have in different countries. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I think there was another gentleman along in the middle there. And then, yes, don't worry, sir. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, Bernard Smith from Amazon Natural Capital Institute. We also have a question concerning governance. I mean, sometimes whenever we focus on the government affairs, we do see some institutions looking to finance governments at the national level, but not in subnational level. And therefore, as you were talking about the approach to address those people that are on the last mile of the situation, my question is concerning how to address that, because actually I don't really see much activities at the subnational level, but always on national level, and the connectivity between both are not always that easy. So it's have you been facing difficulties regarding that, or is there a way to connect both national and subnationals?
The connectivity between national and subnational levels.
True. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then just the last question from the gentleman just on the back there.
Ok. Je m'appelle Sidi Lamine Kone. Je suis du ministère de la Culture du Mali. Bon, je voudrais savoir, au Mali, nous avons des traditions musulmanes d'entretien communautaire des mosquées en terre qui est présentement confrontée à des difficultés liées au changement climatique. Bon, je voudrais savoir si la banque intervient dans le financement dans ce domaine. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna. If we go down the panel, it's probably easy. So I'm going to start with you, Jerome. You have to think about which questions you want to comment on.
Well, quick answers on adaptation. The organization that I talked to, again, in the soft commodities space, funds like Responsibility or Root Capital or Eco Credits or others, the way they look at it is through diversification. And really what they're looking at is farmers who are often working on a single crop. And climate change is, or diseases and other things are creating problems, and so what they look at, and again, it's both the sustainability of the business and climate sustainability is diversification of crops. On the local versus national. again, on the impact investing side, the small organizations, they tend to work very much from a bottom-up, sort of ground-up approach. So it's more about where they're based and which cooperatives and others they work with, rather than have necessarily a country-wide approach. For the GFIs, of course, it's a different story.
Thomas.
Thank you. So there were three quite different questions. I'll answer them in a chronological order. The private financing of adaptation and the mechanisms for that, I have to admit, currently I don't have a position on that. So I want to be clear on that and not dodge it, just to be open and frank on that. We currently focus on soft commodities, deforestation and trade finance, and there's a risk management element in that. And that's the angle we choose because we think that it gives us the largest leverage, largest bang for our buck in sustainability terms, in impact terms. The link between national and subnational levels, I can share a little bit about that, what I've observed in my surroundings. There's a new development, you might have heard of it. It's called the Tropical Landscape Bond. Parties in specifically Indonesia work with provincial governments in order to maintain landscapes. So there's a financial structure being developed, a fund, if you will, in which the investors, the provincial governments, and developers work together to maintain tropical landscapes. And they do that and create livelihoods for smallholders. So that's the interest for the provincial government. You can reach SMEs, you can reach smallholders that way. So that's an innovation which is taking place at this moment. It needs to develop, but I think it's very interesting and worthwhile to watch that space and see how it can be applied, perhaps in different geographies as well, beside Indonesia. And the gentleman of the Ministry of Culture of Mali, hi. The investment in the maintenance of cultural heritage such as mosques, we currently don't have a position on that either. I'm afraid we have to make choices, and currently we are looking at trade finance.
Thank you. First and foremost, on the issue of adaptation, we as a bank do not have a position similar to what was said by my colleague. However, we try to have seminars and workshops whereby we try and disseminate information on adaptation. So this is work in progress and initiatives that are currently ongoing to ensure that this trickles down to all the people involved. Secondly, on the issue of governance and the last mile. What we try to do is we try and monitor. I think that's the best we can do given where we sit. We have offices in Cairo, Cote d'Ivoire, Abuja, Zimbabwe, and in Kenya. We are not in a position to monitor this aggressively. However, we do try and share these metrics with some of the institutions and the borrowers and ensure that they follow through. What we can do is build capacity on that internally to ensure that they follow through on the last mile on the last mile challenge. Again, it is a challenge, but it's something that we're working to ensure that we do monitor closely. And we do disclose this in our annual reports. So it's a key deliverable for the bank. With regards to the issue of the cultural masks for Mali, what the bank does is we try to adhere to the UN issue of the UN outlook on culture and heritage sites. So if this is something that is actually been accepted as something that is to be maintained and regulated, we will try and not intervene in financing such initiatives. Thank you.
Great. So thank you very much to our panel and to you, the audience. I'm gonna wrap up, but before I do, I'm going to invite our panelists to make one last very brief comment. And just as a way of concluding, I would like to think. So we've been very kindly hosted by the Islamic Development Bank and the Islamic Trade Finance Corporation, and it would be interesting, given that we've talked about sustainability and trade finance, to hear from the panel if they have any specific thoughts or recommendations that they would like to leave with our hosts in terms of the role that they can play in delivering some of this. So if I invite everybody kind of briefly to comment on that point, and then I'll close.
I'm all for dialogue. The dialogue and learning and knowledge precede action. So I would encourage actors in the Islamic Development Bank to reach out to a number of trade organizations that exist around sustainable finance, starting with BEI, by the way, or the Global Impact Investing Network and many others, to find actors from which they can learn and with whom they can do business.
Thank you, Jerome. One gentleman said that multilateral development banks are probably going to be leading. I think it was you. And I think that is very true. I think it's very true and very important that multilateral development banks, because of their double mandate, both financing and development, step on the plate and find their role in this big change we are going to need in the world today. And if I look at specifically the Islamic Development Bank and the Islamic Trade Finance Corporation, I see that for certain sectors the opportunity is huge. If I look at the market for soft commodities in the world, and I look at the statistics, and I've looked it up, then the Islamic world, the members of the IDB, has a larger dollar volume of imports in soft commodities than China and Hong Kong combined. I don't hear anybody in the market talk about that. In terms of impact and in terms of strategic importance of food supply to the Islamic world, that's huge. And I think that there could be a great opportunity for the ITFC to be globally leading in this aspect.
Brilliant. Zito, do you want to give us one last concluding thought?
Thank you. The Afrexim Bank was created to actually take on some of these challenges that we're discussing today. They're not easy questions. They're basically very challenging. No solutions will be found in a day or two, but we believe that we're taking the right steps through such fora to discuss some of these initiatives, to see how we can all put it together and work together in ensuring that we do get a solution. We at the African Export-Import Bank are keen to partner with the IDB to come up with solutions and explore ways of taking this discussion further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zito. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Jerome. I've hugely enjoyed this. I hope that the audience have as well. And I think there's some really good questions. I think now we're going to hear from, well, there's going to be a set of final conclusions for the day. But I thank you, everyone, for listening to this very interesting session. Thank you.